Hey, this is Khan, you're watching Ninja Pulls. Welcome to this guide on how to build and play Magicka Arcanist. Magicka Arcanists have been kinda rare from the start, for two reasons. One, Cephaliarch's Flail, one of our main abilities, costs stamina. And two, Coral Riptide, one of the best sets for Arcanists, works much better on stamina characters. These two factors make it slightly easier to play stamina, so almost everyone goes that way with their Arcanist, to the point where people are thinking Magicka Arcanist must be super weak because there are so few. Actually, right now, it's stronger than ever, and resources aren't really an issue. Sure, if you're regularly at risk of being silenced, in Cloud Rest for example, then a stamina beam instead of a Magicka beam has obvious advantages, or if you're really committed to using Riptide wherever possible. But plenty of players dislike that resource minigame, or they just prefer a Magicka Arcanist for whatever reason. And to all those people, I'm happy to say there's really not that much difference. I'm not going to talk solo setups because those are player dependent, mileage will vary, and with no expectations on you, you can do whatever you want. So I won't waste your time with a setup that may or may not work for you. In group content, however, there are expectations, and hopefully buffs, debuffs, and healing will be provided, so our job is to focus on damage, and that I can help you with. Happy? Good, then let's start with the basics. Throw all your attribute points into Magicka, enchant all your armor pieces with Magicka glyphs, and use Consumables to boost your maximum Magicka and to get whatever sustain you need. We'll come back to that. If you're new to Arcanist or want an in-depth guide on how it works, I recently made this video which explains exactly what all the passives do, all the cool little tricks in the class toolkit, and how best to approach the class. The recommended damage abilities are what you'd expect: the Fatecarver beam, exhausting for slightly more damage, or pragmatic for way more survivability, Cephaliarch's Flail, and Inspired Scholarship to build crux between beams, Fulminating Rune, Blockade of Fire, Barb Trap, Quick Cloak, Scalding Rune. That leaves two spots for Banner Bearer, the newest scribed ability, which lets us trade sustain for a whole suite of tasty buffs. It's not mandatory, but hear me out. Obviously it's great in trials where you can buff your teammates, but we also run it for selfish reasons. The banner gives Arcanist an edge, specifically with the class Mastery script, which generates a free crux every 5 seconds, like another Inspired Scholarship. That means you only need one flail between beams, and since the beam is by far our biggest source of damage, squeezing them all closer together is a big deal. So although the banner doesn't directly add any damage, the focus script boosts a damage type, like dots or magical damage. The signature class Mastery script gives us free crux, amazing. And the affix script gives us minor heroism for faster ults, again bringing our burst phases closer together. If you wondered why Banner is so popular now, or if you couldn't see a big difference in your damage when you use it, that's why. It's perfect for Arcanist because our damage is already heavily skewed into dots and magical damage, and because we're super bursty, and class Mastery shrinks the gaps between burst phases. But it's not automatic big deeps for free. You have to earn the extra damage with a solid rotation and good timing. The better those are, the more you get out of the banner. Also, the banner's big drawback, that 33% reduction to recovery, is usually fine on an Arcanist because A, we have great sustain, B, consequently our recovery is low to begin with, so numerically the hit is smaller, and C, Flail is our biggest resource drain, and thanks to the banner, we don't have to flail anywhere near as often, so the sustain situation kinda evens itself out. The default scripts you want to run are probably Flame to buff damage over time, Class Mastery, and Heroism. But if you're in a group with Dragon Knights, Templars, it might be better to buff them with the Magic focus script. That's all magical damage, so Flame, Shock, Frost, and Magic. Or if you need major savagery and prophecy, you can use that affix instead of heroism, and get the heroism from potions instead, or vice versa. Anyway, enough about the banner, you don't have to use it, but hopefully now you see why so many players do. Moving on, I want to quickly mention the Runeblades spammable and why I'm not using or recommending it. Basically, Fatecarver is better in most situations and easier. Runeblades adds some single target damage, but loses a lot of cleave and ease of use, which has a huge influence on damage. And the arrival of Bannerbearer means that Fatecarver isn't as far behind for single target damage as it was, so for now, Runeblades is very much in second place. What about gear? For beginners, I recommend Order's Wrath and Deadly Strike. More details on that on ninjapools.com. For everyone else, we want a trial set with Minor Slayer, and we want mostly medium pieces. We can't use Reliquien with the beam because the stacks will keep falling off, and our stamina isn't stable enough to make the most of Coral Riptide. You can run it on a Magicka setup, but it's not going to be great. For simplicity, we can just use Unsul's Torment. It's not that strong without the interrupt bonus, but it works, with no conditions. So if you're not interested in tweaking your setup from fight to fight, and you don't mind losing damage here and there, Unsul is fine. The other medium set in the running is Slivers of the Null Arca, which isn't perfect either. The slivers can fire at a random target instead of the one we want, but at least the stats are good and the proc damage is decent. Whirl of the Depths is also okay for stationary fights, and if your other set is medium, plus it can be front barred, but I'd say Unsul or Null Arca are smart defaults for a Magicka Arcanist. For the second set, the main options are Deadly Strike, Runecarver's Blaze, and Azure Blight Reaper. Azure Blight is for fights with 3 or more targets, particularly in groups. This set is a no-brainer. Runecarver's Blaze is a lot stronger on the Arcanist now that Banner gives us more beams per minute, plus it has built-in cleave even if it's not on the same level as Azure Blight. Deadly Strike is a jack-of-all-trades, kinda like Unsul. It is weaker than Runecarver for single-target stuff, and it can't compete with Azure Blight in crowded fights, but the damage is fine and it just works anywhere. So if it's not quite a single-target fight, but it's not quite crowded enough for Azure Blight either, Deadly will really come into its own. Highland Sentinel is pretty much just for pushing numbers on the dummy. It's not much use in content. Whatever else you're running, you'll probably want the Velothi Urmage Amulet, the Mythic which is practically mandatory on an Arcanist using Fatecarver, a Slime Crawl one piece, and the Maelstrom Inferno backbar. For traits and glyphs, Bloodthirsty Jewelry with spell damage or weapon damage glyphs. There's zero difference except for that tiny amount of recovery, so pick whichever one you're shortest on. Infused weapon damage on the backbar weapon. Keep up your primary backbar dot, in this case Blockade, and this enchantment will always be active, significantly buffing all of your damage. On the front bar, double charged daggers is a pretty good default. Status effect ticks make up 9 to 12% of our damage against a single target. And Sundered Uptime straight up raises our damage across the board, so this is a smart investment. However, if that percentage decreases, say if we're beaming 3 to 5 targets and Fatecarver or Azure Blight start to really dominate things, then something like Nirnhound on the main hand and Precise on the offhand can perform better, since they will buff everything and not just status effects. Also, if you're short on penetration or critical damage, maces, axes, and the sharpened trait are a very easy way to fix that shortfall and boost your damage by a lot. Don't underestimate these stats. If you're not capping out on either of them, fixing that should be your damage priority. The other way to tweak things is with champion points. Get all of the non-slottables. If you don't have enough CPs for that yet, don't panic. Just grab those that affect damage first, then fill in the rest when you can. Start with the 2 slottables that affect more than half of your damage. In the case of Arcanist, that's easy, since the overwhelming amount of our damage is area of effect, about 70%, and over time, 80%. So we take Biting Aura for AoEs, and Thaumaturge for dots. No other class has such skewed damage ratios, which means we get more out of these slottables than everyone else. The next most powerful slottable is Exploiter, but only if your target is getting pretty good uptimes on off balance. Maximum uptime is about 30%, but if nobody is actively providing this debuff, then slot something else. It's worth saying that off balance can be especially important to Arcanists, because it's such a bursty class, and if we line up our burst with that juicy 10% extra damage window, that can make a big difference. If you're not hitting 18.2k penetration on your target, slot Force of Nature, or tell your tanks to get their shit together, and if you're not at or close to the critical damage cap of 125%, Backstabber and Fighting Finesse. If you still have a spot, Wrathful Strikes is next. Other options include Master at Arms if you can't use Exploiter but you are getting a lot of damage from Azure Blight explosions. Occult Overload if stacked adds are dying regularly. And finally, Arcane Supremacy or Untamed Aggression if you're completely out of ideas. Finally, Consumables. You want a max level savory recipe for Magicka and health. Or for super easy content where you don't need the health, a max level fruit recipe for the most Magicka you can get. There's a full list of the foods and what they do on ninjapulls.com. As for potions, you want Tri-Stat potions. Or if you absolutely can't get Major Prophecy and Savagery any other way, Essence of Spell Power or Weapon Power. Again, it's all on the website along with trash setups and everything else. Now, it's important to stress that none of this is set in stone. There isn't one setup for everything. That would be boring, and it's just not how this game works. Plus, it's fun to tweak your loadout and rotation for different fights. But let's face it, the Arcanist rotation never changes that much. Here's a semi-static rotation you can use as a starting point. Having a static, repeating sequence is great when you're still learning to perfect your gameplay or when you want to concentrate on movement, callouts, mechanics. You don't have to constantly think about the next cast that's coming, but you can still pull great numbers. Then as the class or the fight gets more and more familiar, you can optimize every cast to your heart's content, if you want. Using this rotation as a starting point, plus a little bit of optimizing, I was able to get 128.5k on the dummy, which is pretty damn close to the very best Stamina Arcanist results I've seen this patch. That was with Null Arca and Highland Sentinel. Replace Sentinel with Runecarver and it drops to 121k, at least for me, though I'm sure it can go higher. I found that Ansul and Null Arca performed pretty similarly with this setup, but Null Arca was more consistent and better on average, while Ansul seemed to have higher highs and lower lows, since it boosts our damage spikes. Deadly Strike doesn't do great on a single target like the dummy, but of course it comes into its own when you're beaming multiple targets. Barb Trap and Fulminating Rune aren't shown here because they cannot be recast statically, just work them in as they run out. Scalding Rune doesn't quite last 30 seconds, so you will get a bit of downtime on that, but that's fine, and you can make that a dynamic recast whenever you want. If you're using Azure Blight or Runecarver, you might get more damage by swapping Scalding Rune for Anti-Cavalry Caltrops, since that's a large ground AoE which ticks every second. If you're missing Major Prophecy and Savagery, you can also drop Trap for Camouflaged Hunter. We already have Minor Force from the Urmage Mythic, and in big, multi-target fights, the single target dot and hemorrhaging from Trap becomes less valuable. Finally, if you're regularly taking damage, you can use Crux Weaver Armor as yet another source of free Crux. So you hardly ever need to use Flail, only to refresh the Abyssal Ink debuff every 20 seconds. But as a default, this will do fine. Pre-buff with Cloak, Scholarship, Scalding Rune, Trap, then Ult, Flail, Blockade, and Beam. I tend to hold Fulminating Rune so I get off more beam ticks in that first off balance, then cast that, Flail, and Beam again. I'm using the add-on Pen Test to track off balance. There are other ways to do it, including the vanilla game UI, but this is neat and super easy. If you're new or not into tryharding, you do not need to track off balance. You might only lose 2% damage, but then again, you might lose more. The idea is to see an off balance phase coming, and if you can, line up your burst phase, meaning your Fatecarver beam or ideally Fatecarver plus your ult, so that your damage spike coincides perfectly with that off balance phase, and all of it gets boosted by the Exploiter CP and drags up your average DPS. Simple in theory, but in practice it doesn't always work out that neatly, so don't sweat it. Another thing you might notice here is the green square next to my ult. This is a fairly new feature on ESO's Crux Tracker add-on, and it shows a timer for the Crux being generated by the banner. I ignore it most of the time, but now and then I glance at it to see if I'm going to need to flail or not. If the banner is about to get you your third Crux anyway, then flail is going to be a damage loss, so it's cool to have a heads up. Just another small optimization if you're interested, totally not needed, but I thought I'd mention it and give a quick shout out to ESO for making some really great add-ons. You don't want to waste any of those Crux, so try not to flail unnecessarily or let the banner tick again at 3 stacks. Better to let one of your dots expire for a few seconds and come back to it. I'm using the Flame banner with Class Mastery and Major Prophecy and Savagery, plus Heroism Potions. But in content, you should be able to get Savagery and Prophecy, so you can just use regular Tri-Stat Potions and put Heroism on the banner instead. Or slot Camouflaged Hunter instead of Trap, as we already discussed. If you find you're just not able to line up your ult with the off-balance phases, check your speed and your weaving. 1 cast per second, or as close to that as possible. But if you're rushing, your light attacks can easily get skipped and you'll miss a lot of ulti-gen. In fact, when players post DPS tests for me to look at in our Discord, this is one of the biggest damage losses with the Arcanist. People think because they're using Mage, they don't need to weave. Wrong. There's still quite a bit of damage to be gained from it. Just don't worry about that light attack that comes just before the beam. That one often gets overridden, but so long as you hit the others, your ult should keep ticking up. That's it. I'm updating the Ninja Pulse website with all the DPS classes as these videos come out, and you'll find more guidance there on trash setups, consumables, CPs, and all that good stuff. Thanks so much for watching this video, I really hope it helps. Like I said, I plan to do all 14 classes, so if you want to see those, please support Ninja Pulse however you can. Join our members area for exclusive trifecta walkthroughs, come hang out with me and Maya on Twitch and throw us a sub on there, or just like and share the videos. Any and all of the above are greatly appreciated. Thanks so much guys, have a great 2025, and I'll see you in the next one.